Hello and welcome to In Conversation with the history holders of the American Dance Therapy Association, a project made possible by the Marian Chace Foundation. My name is Dr. Jacelyn Biondo. When I first conceived of making these videos, I hoped to capture the words of the women who studied with the firsts in our field: Marian Chace, Trudy Shoup, Mary Whitehouse, Alma Hawkins, Blanche Evans, and Lillian Espinack. What culminated in the process was an opportunity to have these women share their stories and their memories in their own words, and to capture these parts of history for future generations. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy our conversations. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Marcia Leventhal today to be in conversation. Dr. Leventhal, nice to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. So just to start us off, if you wouldn't mind sharing, I know there's many mentors that you had in dance therapy, if you could share with whom and where you studied dance therapy.
Well, now this is a very difficult question because I didn't study dance therapy. There was no such animal when I did my master's degree. I wrote the first master's thesis on the topic of dance and psychotherapy, actually in the world that we know of, at UCLA. So I have a lot of teachers that over the years I was able to integrate and assimilate, and when I was put in some kind of position where I had to create programs or do dance therapy, as we started to call it later than when I did my master's thesis, those are my teachers. But I'm from California, and at the time, when I was doing my master's degree, which was in the early 60s to mid 60s, Marian Chace was already doing her work at St. Elizabeth's. But this is way before we had internet. So people heard about it in a vague way. And we'd heard about it too, because we studied history of dance and all kinds of things. I was doing a master's in dance at UCLA, but there wasn't a lot, and very few people. I mean, we had Trudy Shoup and Jerry Salkin, who were at Camarillo State Hospital doing something called body ego technique, and Mary Whitehouse, who was brought to UCLA to work with the dance majors by Alma Hawkins, who was the chairman of the dance department. But Mary wasn't doing dance therapy. She was just starting something she was calling movement in depth. And in a way, we were her first, we could say, research subject, so to speak. So there was a lot of input, and a lot of input from Just Dance. We had in those days, we called it the golden age of UCLA, or later, those of us that went there called it that, because Alma Hawkins was extraordinary in the people that she brought to teach us. So we got to study with Merce Cunningham and John Cage and Gus Solomons Jr. and Donnie McHale and on and on and on. She brought these masters in dance. And I know this is a long answer to your question, because it isn't like I can say, oh yes, well, I was mentored by. No, there was no such thing. But when I pull it all together, that's how I then ended up being a dance therapist and initiating a lot of programs worldwide and also in New York. But when I went to New York and was starting to work there, I was the first person from the West Coast who had worked with people on the West Coast to the East Coast, where at that point people had just worked with Marian Chace. Blanche Evans had only just begun her own studio, and also in the mid to late 60s. And Trudy Shoup and Jerry Salkin wrote their book in 1974, Won't You Join the Dance, which was the first time it really started to put dance therapy on the map. So I can go on and tell you how I ended up becoming a dance therapist, if you'd like to know that, and mention all the people that I think are very significant, and actually were very significant in helping even the ADTA form and move on from the early days to now.
Yeah, I would love that. It's actually moving us into the second question, which is really around like what drew you into this notion of dance therapy or dance psychotherapy or movement as therapy, that kind of role. Okay, well, so if you want to speak to that a little bit, that would be lovely.
Sure. Okay, so you have to know a little bit about me in order to understand that. I've always been an actor and a dancer, and always having to have an education as well. So it was never like, I'm going to be an actress and therefore I'm going to go to Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London. No, it was fine, but you're going to have to also get your education. And that happened because my dad, at a very young age, he was, I think, 39, had a massive heart attack. And my brother and I were very young. He was older than me, and my sister was a baby. She was maybe a year and a half or two. But we were taken into the hospital to say goodbye to him. And they didn't have a lot of, they didn't do a lot in those days for heart attacks. You died or you lived. And he had been a veteran, so he was in the Veterans Hospital. And I had just won an all-city essay contest on how you could prevent forest fires. I was probably 7 or 8. So my mom was really proud, and she, brought us in and said, oh, and I was Marcia then. Marcia B has won this wonderful award, and he was thrilled. And then he looked at my brother and I, and my sister, of course, was a little too young to understand it. And he said, I want you to make me a promise. He said, I don't care whether you have to scrub floors, but you have to promise me that you're going to get your education, and you will never, ever let that go. Your education has to come first. So on his dying bed, by the way, he lived to be 89, he did not die. He made us promise. So that was kind of inside our bones. So it never even was a thought that because I was, singing and dancing later and, acting all over the place, that I would go to just go study drama or something. We went to university, my brother, my sister, and I all did. And that, I think that's always been part of my soul in a way. And I'm not unhappy about it. So that's who I am. So fast forward, I graduated from university, and I had gone to Europe to further my education. I studied pantomime in Paris, Mime, with Jacques Lecoq, and I was also studying international law because I always had to do one or two together. Why international law? Don't ask me. And long story short, all my friends were going to graduate school, to be lawyers, to be doctors, to be social workers, and none of that appealed to me. But I thought I had to go to graduate school like everybody else. And I was very young. I graduated college 2 years ahead of myself. I was a baby. And I thought, well, and I remembered my dance department at UCLA, because I think we visited it from high school. So I'd met Alma Hawkins when I was a kid, 15 maybe years old or something. And I thought, well, I'll get a master's in dance, not thinking beyond that. And I applied I was in Paris at the time, and I got accepted, whatever that means, because I don't think you needed a lot to get accepted in those days. And I got back to school, but not really. I was so reluctant to go. I had a boyfriend, and I didn't want to leave, and I didn't want to leave Paris, but I somehow dragged myself back and got to UCLA a week or two after classes had started, and I had a paper due the next day. Now, I was used to staying up all night to write papers when I went to college. I went to college back east, a very good liberal arts school, and I just stayed up all night and wrote a paper and got a really good grade on it. And Alma Hawkins brought me into her office because she needed to meet me and know a little bit more about me, even though I'd come late and so forth. She allowed me to start the program. And then she said, would you like a teaching assistantship? And I said, yeah, I mean, of course. So I just assumed a teaching assistantship in the dance department would mean that I would be teaching modern dance 1A to PE majors. And she said, okay, fine. I signed the papers, whatever they were, who knows. And it was going to give me a stipend monthly, which was great because that would cover the rent that I was sharing an apartment with 2 or 3 other women. And, it would have covered that, and plus my tuition. Tuition was very low in those days. And she said, meet me at NPI tomorrow at 12 o'clock, whatever it was. I didn't know what NPI meant, but I was afraid to say anything to her. So I asked around, and I didn't really know what's NPI, what's NPI. They said, well, you go down the hill. And we were in the dance department, which was in the women's gym, up the road, like a quarter of a mile or a third of a mile. And you go down, and that's NPI, the Neuropsychiatric Institute. I thought, okay, maybe they do classes there, who knows? So there I show up at NPI, and she is doing dance for short-term psychiatric patients. So that was an eye-opener. Now, I have to cut back in that story because without this other person I'm going to mention, there probably never would have been dance therapy at UCLA, and I never would have become a dance therapist. Dr. J. Alfred Cannon was the chief psychiatrist at the NPI. And he grew up in a ghetto. He was an African-American man in Long Island and was a very talented football player. And because of that, he got a scholarship to a very, very prestigious college. So his future was made. He was going to, play ball, get his degree, become a professional ball player. And he had a very serious injury and had to give up football. And he was very depressed. And one of his professors said, Al, you're a very smart guy. Why don't you apply to medical school? He applied and got into medical school. A very good college in New York City. He was bored out of his mind. And he'd walk the streets of New York and just whatever he was doing, meditating and thinking, and knowing he wasn't going to quit. He wasn't a quitter. Athletes and dancers never quit, as small aside. And anyway, one day he hears music coming from a brownstone, and it looked like something you could enter. It didn't look like a private home. And he walks in, and there's a dance class going on. That was Martha Graham's studio. And that was the beginning of his transformation. Now, I'm not sure where he studied, but he did some dance training because of that moment while he's doing all of his medical training. And he vowed, because things were happening to him, it helped him understand what was going on and some of his unhappiness and depression or whatever. And he vowed that if ever he was in a position to hire dancers to work, he wanted to be a psychiatrist, he knew that at that point, he was going to hire dancers to work with psychiatric patients because he knew that it could be a real inroad to helping them. So now he's at UCLA, he's chief resident psychiatrist at NPI, very prestigious position. Young guy, he's in his 30s. And he hears about this dance department and he hears about Alma Hawkins, and she was very well known at that point. So he goes up the hill to our dance department and introduces himself, and he says to Dr. Hawkins, I'm Dr. Cannon, I'm NPI, I have a hunch that maybe dancing would help my psychiatric patients. And we don't have a lot of treatment for them, we have medication, and would you be willing to come down and give it a try? And she was at a turning point in her life. She is an extraordinary woman, and I owe so much to her, and I'm so grateful. She was my mentor. She created a dance department, just in an amazing way, always believing in dance, but at the same time bringing in all these amazing, not only dancers, but big thinkers of the time. So we learned from everybody doing all the research on the brain and on the relaxation response, and Jacobson, and on and on and on. She bring in people because she felt all of that somehow contributed to dance and to the dancer developing. And she had a whole theory about creativity. She'd worked with Harold Rugg, and she really believed everybody had a creative place in them, and that if you could find the way in, they would flourish, and on and on. And that's how she created dancers in the dance department. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it was extraordinary what she did. Now, she'd been doing that now for, I don't remember how long at that point, 10, 15 years, and she was looking for a challenge. So she said yes to Dr. Cannon. And when I came into the picture, when I was asked to be a teaching assistant, she had been doing that for one semester, I believe. So she was new to it, and I was new to it. And I started to have an affinity for working with some of the children. These are all short-term. And she and Dr. Cannon, with the support of Dr. Hunt, who I'll come to in a minute, decided that for the first time ever, the dance department would allow a research thesis and not a choreographic thesis for the master's degree. Because between Dr. Cannon, Dr. Hunt, and Dr. Hawkins, they thought that we have to get some research because we really think this dance thing is working. So I was the chosen one, so to speak. I didn't have much to say about it because they liked what I was doing with these kids. And I ended up working with 4 who had been diagnosed with schizophrenic children, one-on-one. And that was the beginning of the change of my world totally. Ended up having a master's thesis, which was a research thesis. We hypothesized, because Dr. Hunt was on the team and she was a great research person at UCLA, we hypothesized that a change in body image through this dance event would create a change in self-concept affecting the child's ability to socialize, to learn, and on and on and on. And I did all kinds of pre and post tests. I had to research all this. I know nothing. I think 2 psych courses in college, an introduction to psychology 1A, which of course, is almost nothing, and then an existential psychology course, and that was it. So I was a total newbie, but I knew dance and I knew movement. I've been doing that my whole life, and I loved dance and movement, and it's something that always was important for me, just to find out who I was forever. From the time I was 3 years old. So I started to work with these kids without any real model. I couldn't do what Dr. Hawkins was doing with the adolescents and the adults because it wasn't appropriate for children. So I would just start to move with them and follow them, and they'd follow me, and we'd get into some kind of zone, and we would create together. It was an amazing time. A lot happens. I mean, I can't go into all of it right now, but everything was being filmed, and I was being observed like in I could say an arena, like I was, in the days of Rome, I felt like I was in an arena with the lions were going to come in any minute. And I would just have to tune everybody out because Dr. Cannon told everybody about this rare research project that was going on. So psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, teachers, counselors, everyone were coming in to watch. They go in and they come out, and I would just be with that child, just focused, and moving and whatever we had to do. And Dr. Cannon was amazing because he made carte blanche at NPI. He made sure everybody knew who I was and that everything was open to me, all the charts. I could go to anybody's office and interview them. It was just, that was it, carte blanche. Anyway, one day I remember, it was difficult. It was difficult, especially tuning everyone out and being with the child, but that was working beautifully. And I remember Dr. Hawkins had come that day to watch. And I said, Dr. Hawkins, have you ever doubted? And I hadn't finished my sentence. And she said, dance, never. And that stayed with me. That just went clunk inside. And I had made some notes before, just thinking about it, the people that influenced me. And that's something they all had in common. They had a very deep belief in something important. And I think that's when I learned not knowing how to articulate it yet. I didn't have the language yet of the importance of intent and deep belief no matter what. And of course, there was Dr. Cannon believing in the whole thing. But at any rate, when the thesis was done, and I had to spend probably an extra year because there was so much research. And by the way, there was very little, I had to go into the stacks. There was no such thing as internet or Google, you went down into the bowels of the library, and I was pulling out whatever I could find that might relate in some way. And it was not easy. I still remember the dust and so forth. At that time, there was one book written on dance and psychotherapy, and it was by a woman named Elizabeth Rose, and that was it. And she was from back east. So it was really nothing. I interviewed Whitehouse and Hawkins and Hunt. I'm not even sure at this point. But the point was, from the pre and post tests, they hired a statistician, UCLA, and the results were accepted. And when I turned in the final copy, the signed copy that you bring and you give it to your committee and then it goes to the library, the committee said to me, this could have been a doctoral dissertation. And I thought, now they tell me, another year of my life had gone by where I wasn't doing what I came to do, which was to dance and wait for my big break. I'd already done quite a few films in Rome, and I'd done a lot of theater. Anyway, that's a story. And Dr. Hunt taught kinesiology to the dance majors, and she was just a brilliant researcher. And I ended up being her research assistant as well as the teaching assistantship. So I had these 2 fellowships, and that gave me a lot of background and incentive and an understanding of research. And she had just taken on a challenge at a very well-known school at the time, the juvenile schools for, I think it was called Seriously Disturbed Children, but it was a special school. And she was going to do a research project there. And she brought me along, and I did the movement, and then she did all the research. And we would meet weekly, and I learned so much from her about the children and about how you do research and what you look for and so on and so forth. So between Dr. Hawkins, Dr. Hunt, and Dr. Cannon, that was the beginning. And that was really the beginning of there being a dance therapy program at UCLA, which is interesting because I ended up directing the program at NYU, and all our programs began at the same time, UCLA, based on the fact that I did this research, and they decided, Dr. Cannon and Dr. Hunt decided to do a seminar, dance in healing or dance in psychotherapy, something like that. It became the dance therapy program. And then I ended up being the director at NYU. Long story.
A good story, though. So it sounds to me, Dr. Leventhal, like there was a lot that kind of came together to inform your education at that point. Thinking back to Alma Hawkins particularly, and focusing in a little bit on this idea of dance therapy kind of emerging, can you share a little bit about studying under Dr. Hawkins and perhaps what stood out in her teaching to you?
Well, the main thing about Dr. Hawkins that I want to say is that she thought broadly, and she believed in dance totally. So if you could learn to think broadly, I mean, and you know, we didn't call it out of the box in those days, think broadly and go from, you know, some kind of physiological piece and some kind of working with creativity piece and some kind of working with the body piece and pull it all together. She supported that. And she also was a big proponent of understanding the creative process and having a belief that everybody has a creative soul, so to speak. I don't think she would have used the word soul. I use that word now in my work. But that was what she supported. And I think it gave all of us, not think I know, it gave all of us a real boost up, because all of us that were there around that time ended up doing something very significant with our lives. Some of us that were there started major dance companies. One of the people helped create Pilobolus, was their stage manager for years, and then also became head of funding for all the arts in New York State. I mean, people just did something, and I think it's because of Alma Hawkins just there, it just permeated who we were. So even, you know, we taught the regular stuff that you learn in graduate school. I mean, history of dance, and, you know, we learned who all the greats were. And of course, we studied Isadora and dance and education, and the same problems then we still have now. The arts are the last thing funded and the first thing that gets kicked out. And dance is the last of the arts that gets funded and the very first of the arts that gets, you know, same problems are still existing now. It's very sad. But no, that's who she was. And she created this dance department. She herself was remarkable. She came from Iowa and got herself a master's degree in New York, and then a doctorate, and studied with all the greats of the time, all the thinkers that were significant in terms of opening up new avenues of thinking. And also she went and did whoever was teaching dance at the time, whether it was Hanya Holm or everybody who was around then. She studied dance. And I remember, because I did an interview with her, and she shared how she would go from place to place with her little phonograph and her records, you know, to go where she was going, to the YMCA or the YWCA or the rec room at some center. You know, she did all that. She paid her dues and got a doctorate and came to UCLA, and she just was extremely well respected by all the other departments because she was so well educated on so many areas. And again, she shared that with her students. She was very generous. She would bring amazing people in to teach us in the summer.
As a dancer, speaking to a dancer, right, we understand this power that the dance holds. And to have a group or a cohort that you're studying from, learning with, sharing with, collaborating with at the moment, who all may have a little bit of a different background, but all believe in that power, is a really remarkable time to have been. I've heard this before from others, and it's just a really special meeting of minds that comes together that I wish we had a little bit more of, that continues on now. I hear a lot about them in times past, but it sounds like
that's what's very difficult for me. You know, I ran created and ran the program at NYU for 17 years. And we were very clear that you had to be a dancer to enter the program. And people say, but yeah, but you're not really teaching dance. No, you're not. But unless you've made these changes in your own body, you're going to be trying to make those changes the whole time you're working with your clients. So in our interview, we did a movement interview, a dance interview, and obviously a verbal interview, and then of course looked at grades and so forth. But if people could move organically, and it's very different than being able to dance, we would give them a try, because that was very difficult to teach someone. That organic movement where you don't change it because it's your turn, but you learn how to flow and go deep and on and on. And it worked. And I think, I remember we got, at one point, a lot of people left Balanchine's company, and several came to study NYU in our program to become dance therapists. And they had a hell of a time the first year, because they could do all the beautiful ballet and they couldn't move. They couldn't improvise. All they could do would be tour jeté, jeté, that was their improvisation. And it took a year or more to get through all of that structure and that thing that held them together, that they thought they knew to dance. And then they got into the feeling and the depth and the spontaneous movement. It was something very interesting to see that. Mm. So yeah, but I know that we were very, very clear that you had to be able to dance and move to come to our program. And people knew that when they came. And as a result, we got some wonderful, just some fantastic people went through the program. Mm. And I guess what's been hard for me is watching over the years that it became very important for people to get their counseling degree, and they do this and they do that, and they didn't dance anymore. A lot of programs, they hardly move. They hardly move, and I don't really know what they're doing with clients now. Mm. I don't know.
So thinking about that a little bit, and thinking about studying dance therapy and becoming a dance therapist and practicing, and all of it kind of wrapped up together, what would you say is the essence of dance therapy as you understand it, but also as you understand it from your mentor, from Dr. Alma Hawkins, and learning from her?
Well, I can't say from Dr. Hawkins, because I'm not Dr. Hawkins, and I took what I needed to take to create the programs I created in New York. Because when I came to New York, I was the only game in town. There were one or two small things happening, and I literally got hired my first day in New York to do dance therapy. I had my thesis and my abstract of my thesis, and I went to the Manhattan School for Seriously Disturbed Children, and they looked at it and they looked at me and they said, "You're hired." Now, what I didn't tell you is that when I was doing my master's, Dr. Hunt had just come back from a year sabbatical in England, and she had studied with Marian North. So she brought effort shape back to UCLA way before Irmgard was teaching it in New York. And she taught me effort shape, basic, and that's one of the analysis I did for my thesis. I watched all this film, and I analyzed the children's movement from beginning to end. So I already had that effort shape background. So when I came to New York and I was sleeping on my cousin's couch, I'd come from Rome, from doing all these films and acting and so forth. I went to a phone book and I just looked up, I think I looked up autism maybe, or special children, I don't know. And it seemed to be a place right near my cousin. So I called them and they said, "Come right over." And I did. And I was hired on the spot. Now, I couldn't do what Dr. Hawkins did when she was doing dance for psychiatric patients. She eventually evolved, but she was evolving at the same time I was evolving in a whole different place in a different state. So what I learned from Hawkins, from Hunt, and from Cannon is this deep belief system that translates into believing in yourself and trusting. Now we know, of course, about the vagus nerve and breath and mindfulness and all these things that we didn't talk about then, but that, you trust your gut. And for some reason, I've always trusted my gut. So when things felt right, I knew they were right. But I also was very clear on having to educate myself and to be on a par with everybody else I'd be working with. So when I was hired at this school, this very prestigious school, it was in the First Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue in New York. It was called the Manhattan School for Seriously Disturbed Children. And I said, I'm going to need to observe for a little time. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have a clue. Suddenly they've hired me, I have a job. And after the first week, the principal comes up to me, she said, okay, you've observed enough, now start working. And I've written about that. I have quite a few articles out there working with the special children, but that was the beginning. And then from that beginning, Irmgard was starting to teach an effort shape class, and she asked me to be her assistant. So I assisted Irmgard in doing effort shape for a year, my first year in New York. And this is before there was the CMA program. There wasn't LIMS yet or anything. And there was a group of us, all of us starting to do dance therapy. Some people had done some work with Marian Chace. That was it. And I was a person who had come from the West Coast. I had worked with Mary Whitehouse, who I was very affected by the way. And she was very early in what she was doing as well. And, you know, I brought I was the one that bridged that gap because I was the only one that hadn't worked with Marian Chace, but I had done all this other work. I was the first one with a master's degree in the area. So a lot happened. And probably by the first month in New York, I had more work than I could handle. I was working, I like to say, 8 days a week. I was working in all the boroughs, starting programs, and I had to do this from scratch. There were no models for me. So it's hard to say what I got from my mentor. I've certainly always honored my mentors in the sense that they were there, they supported me. I would call Dr. Hunt probably 3 times a week from New York to California when I started to work in several spots in Brooklyn, and I wanted to do research because they wanted to know what I was doing and if it made a difference. And finally one day she said, you know, you can do it. You don't need to call me anymore. And she cut the string, cut the tie like that. And that freed me. But I had all that background that she'd, imbued to me. So it's very hard for me to answer that question because I didn't copy anything Alma did. If anything, a lot of things she did, I wouldn't do. I wouldn't wear leotards and tights when I did dance therapy. I felt dance therapy should be done in your street clothes, so it's natural. I didn't use music. I found that music was really hindered, especially working with children. I, of course, use it from time to time now, but as I tell my people that I train, you have to understand your music as well as you understand your dance. Because what I saw in the years I've been supervising and directing the program at NYU is that when I would go to see students in the field and they would be doing their internship or pre-internship, the person they'd work with would put on something and the music would just go on and on and on, or they'd stop in the middle of a session and go and change the music. And I thought, this is not okay. This is breaking the flow. Where's the organicity? We're working with fragmented personalities. We can't keep breaking the flow. So a lot of things that Alma did, I wouldn't do. But the thing I learned from her and also from Blanche Evan, I ended up working with all these people. Blanche and Alma could say, all right, today we're going to work on how does these glasses work? So if I open them, I'm making this up by the way. Can you open yourself like that? Can you look through the glasses and make yourself bigger? So they would use props to stimulate the imagination. And Blanche was fabulous at that. And I learned that from Alma as well. She'd bring in all kinds of things, photographs of things and different kinds of props that she used, but always with a clear intent that she was stimulating the imagination and getting into the range. And so clearly range has been something I've always felt was very important, that unless we, the dance therapists, have our own range, not only all the big things we can do, but all the small things and feel comfortable with that, we can't even perceive, we can't have empathic attunement with our clients or our patients.
One thing I do want to circle back to is your mentioning of Mary Whitehouse a few times, and I'm just very openly, is there anything you want to share about?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
So Alma discovered Mary as well. She discovered everybody. Mary didn't, I think, do her studio until 1966, and my master's thesis was finished and submitted in 65. But we'd worked with Mary for a couple of years. She brought her to UCLA. Now, Mary had also worked with Wigman, and she also had a Jungian analysis. And now, if you know anything about Wigman was the one that really got into what you feel is what you dance. And Wigman had also worked with Laban. So there's a lot of threads there that I obviously am not going to get into now, but all these threads. So Mary is there with understanding that when you move, and for instance, she taught us, when she taught us, the Graham contraction, which of course we knew, contraction release, she talked about the agony and the ecstasy. And then you found your agony and your ecstasy, so that then we're doing the movement, and the movement then came from the feeling. So she was very much into that early on. Now, here's our first introduction to Mary. There's, I think, 6 or 7 of us. We were the master's students at that time. And we're being introduced to Mary, and we were told that she's a very important person. And she does this wonderful, she'd been a dancer, and she'd worked with Mary Fleegman, and we knew who Mary Fleegman was. And so she comes in and she says, okay, girls, I want you to lie down on the floor, and here's my direction to you. I don't want you to start to move until you feel the impulse to move, and let that impulse carry you into your movement. So we don't know what she's talking about. Impulse to move, what does that mean? But we lie down on the floor, because we're very good with impulse. Lie down on the floor, and I'm lying there and thinking, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. What does she mean, impulse? Where does the impulse? Where's that impulse? What does that mean, impulse? I'm kind of fidgeting a little, and out of the peripheral vision and seeing, I see someone stands up and they start to do pantomime, and somebody else starts to come up and they're leaping, flying, and I'm thinking, I'm gonna be kicked out of this program. I'm gonna fail. I don't know what she means. I don't know what to do, and I just lay there, breathing, and kind of, changing position. And then finally I thought, just because everybody else was doing something, I did very little, just a little bit of something. And then she finally ends this agony, the agony of the ecstasy. She ends the agony. And she says, okay, tell me about what you did. And everybody's telling, and it was really hard. Before I could even finish, she said, and I want you all to know that only one person followed my direction, and that was Marcia. What? Now that is my introduction to Mary. I didn't know what I did, but what she was looking for is something a lot more subtle. And we didn't have the language in those days. We didn't have the language. And then, of course, we started to do a lot of work with her. But one of the things that I wanted to share too about Mary, Mary, because she'd had the Jungian analysis and she had danced, and one of the articles about her said that she never taught dance, she taught people. When she started her studio with a woman named Jane Manning, a lot of teachers would come to her because they needed to just move to relax and to get rid of tension and stress, which is very interesting because that's very similar to what Marian Chace was doing in back east. I remember, Mary eventually was cut down with MS, and another friend who then, when I moved to New York, a lot of people continued working with Mary, and of course I didn't. I was in New York now. But long story short, this person then ended up teaching at UCLA, and I'm teaching at NYU. I'm back home because California, Los Angeles is my home. I was back visiting my folks. And Mary, she was in remission. So we went to have lunch with her, and we're talking about what we're doing. And Mary was still, our teacher, and we loved her. And, as I talk about it, I feel something deep inside moving. And she looked at us and she said, you girls know so much more than I ever knew. I'm so proud of you. And we didn't even know what she meant, but we could hear it because we'd been training and studying and catching up all the things we needed to do in order to teach. My friend was teaching at UCLA and I was teaching at NYU. And then Mary also did a lot of things that in a way, she taught us not to do. You can't be friends with your clients. You're a therapist. And you have to be clear about that boundary. And she often talked to us, and not often, once or twice, said something about when that boundary is broken, that could bring disease, that could bring illness. And of course, knowing what I know and what I've studied about energy and the energy field, because of my years of research with Dr. Hunt, I understand that completely and what we know now about illness and disease and healing. So Mary was very special in that way. And one of the things that, I don't know if you know, but I did a panel at La Jolla a few years ago. I was the Embodied protege. I've been working a lot over the years on embodiment, and I realized that all of us took something from our mentors. And it was in our being, in our cells. So when we taught, when we danced, when we moved, it was there. And I wanted to get that across to the audience. And then at the end, we danced and had people dance with whoever they were attracted to understand how this thing gets passed on. And that whole concept of that came from some very small thing. Years ago, I think it was Sharon who called me and said, "Do you have any tapes from your work with Mary?" And I looked, and I was looking to see, did I have anything? And because we'd come together and we'd do workshops and so forth. And I found a tape, and I said, "No, I found one. I thought it was Mary, but it's me." And then I listened again, and it was Mary. And I realized how deeply I'd been affected by how she led. Mm. Because, when you taught dance in those days, you do the routine and you taught, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And people knew the bar, they knew what you did in the center. And Mary she facilitated, and that's what I did. And I realized that came from Mary, the way I facilitated. Mm. And the voice sounded the same. I thought it was me, and it was Mary. Mm. That was quite, and then that was the genesis of my starting to think about the embodied protege panel.
It's interesting how much we absorb non-verbally from our people, our mentors, our teachers, our partners in life, our kind of soulmates, that we don't necessarily realize it's there until it kind of surfaces on its own and we recognize it.
Yeah, and the thing that I've really spending years doing, and I talk about it in my article that was Marian Chace lecture. It was in the ADTA journal, then it was republished in its entirety because the journal cut it to shreds. So they got permission to publish the whole speech in Moving On, the journal from the Dance Therapy Association of Australia. One of the things I talk about in the article is finding our own language. Because for years we had to borrow language. We had to borrow psychodynamic language. We had to borrow language from every, I know when I first started working in New York with this special education, I borrowed language from the sensory motor and perceptual motor people. But eventually I felt that we had a language, we hadn't discovered it yet. See, one of the things I forgot to say too about Alma, she introduced it to Susan Langer. And that's the idea of going to the felt level. And ultimately, that's what really affected Jacelyn's work. And many of us in New York at that time worked with Jacelyn. He came to New York, he had a sabbatical there. So he ended up doing dance therapy. And we knew Jacelyn very well, and he was working on focusing that. But that focusing really comes from Suzanne Langer's work, and that was introduced to us by Alma Hawkins. So going to the felt level was something I'd known since I did my master's. Mm. But this is brand new. People didn't know it, and you had to open people up to these new ideas. Even the language you're using is such wonderfully open, inclusive language. It didn't exist then because people didn't know it. Right. It wasn't in their bodies. Mm-hmm. But because I was directing this program at NYU, different media would hear about it. So we be an interview for television or Mademoiselle magazine or whatever. And it was interesting how when I started to get invited to do different workshops at different conferences, and I was really still a novice. I really didn't know what I was doing. It was different. I worked with kids. I started to create a model, but now working with normal urban neurotics, as Blanche would have called it, Blanche Evans, in these huge, 50, 100, 200 people. And people would come up to me and they'd say that was the most profound experience I ever had. And I wouldn't know what they were talking about. And they say, I've been in therapy for 10 years. I got more out of that hour than I've gotten out of all my therapy. So I started to look at what I was doing with these people. It wasn't me, it was the material, it was the work. And it started to, it was like a ripple effect.
That actually ties nicely into my next question, which is thinking back of all of the people that you may have worked with as a dance therapist. Is there a particular patient experience that was meaningful for you that you would like to share?
Well, I have, as you said, two come to mind. One is, and I learned from everybody. I'll start with one of the children. So this is at the Manhattan School for Serious and Disturbed Children, and I have a million stories. Let me just give you a really short one. There was a little boy I was working with at the infants home in Brooklyn, and these were kids that were kicked out of the regular schools and sent there because they were behavior problems. but they were really on the spectrum, and we didn't have the idea of the spectrum in those days. So this little kid would come in and he'd go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And he did this for months and months and months, and I could not for the life of me. But we worked, and he would get through the session, and little by little. And finally, the last day of the term, he comes up to me and he goes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I was going to call him John. He wasn't John. I said, John, no matter how many times you count and stick your hand in my face, I'm still going to be here. I'm not going to disappear. And that ended it. It never happened again. This strange thing that he would do, because a lot of the autistic kids had some strange thing they did. Once you can interpret a gesture, and it's right, the interpretation is correct, it leaves. It's almost like they're trying to tell you something. You know, when you have a pet, how the pet learns our language and we never learn the pet's language. And when you're working in another language, autism is another language, but every autistic kid has their own language. So it's not like you learn French and you can speak French. No, every autistic kid has their own language. You have to learn that language. So finally, when you can interpret whatever it is, whether it's this or something else found, I think of it to this day. So it's a group of 2 at the Manhattan School, a little girl and a little boy. He was very small for his age. Probably he was, I want to say 8 or 9. And she was a little bit bigger for her age, but it's fine. So I'm doing what I do with special kids, which is a lot of, no, they must have been younger because I was doing a lot of rocking and holding. So they probably were 6, 7. And, you know, I do a lot of beginning to get into flow through rocking and so forth. And I would do one at a time. And then I would say, I'm going to call him John as well. I'd say, so it'd be, Cindy would do her turn, and then she'd sit down. I say, and now John, it's your turn again. No, and he would have his legs open position and go, ah, ah, ah. And I always felt like he was breathing fire on me. I say, okay. And then I would give her turn, your turn, and he'd breathe his fire on me. This went on for the entire school semester. But I never said, you know, come, and I never tried to force him in any way. I just let him do what he needed to do. But I had all kinds of thoughts and feelings about this. And I would do it, and I would say, what does it feel like? And his parents had been missionaries in Africa. And I just got this feeling, it was like the Dybbuk in some way. Something had come to him, or he'd been part of some ceremony. He was just keeping the bad things away. It's always felt that way. So we do this whole semester, however many months it was, and he shows up. That to me was great. Little girl, things with her. He comes, and last day of school again, and I say, John's turn, and he gets up, plops himself down in my lap, and goes to sleep. Now, the teacher, who was always in the corner, this particular 2 children of that class, she looks at me and I look at her. We let him sleep for a little bit, and then as he got up, he allowed me to do the entire session. It's not the end of the story. The next semester, he became my assistant. He self-directed assistant. It was a session, now 2 children again. Also, now this was a little girl who was probably a year younger than him and 4 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier. And they thought she was deaf. I tried to tell them she wasn't, because I could see that she rhythmically understood and whatever. She got her language eventually. And he came for his turn. And if I spent too much time with him for his turn, he'd say, no, Darlene's turn. That's not her name. Darlene's turn. Oh, thank you so much, John. I appreciate that. Until they ended up moving together, and it was an amazing thing. It was just an amazing thing. And then he became the star of the school in terms of movement. He was my assistant. Yeah. So that is something that I just hold in my heart. The other one is something I learned about. There's a part of us that is the conflict-free zone, which of course, I think Jacobson wrote about it. You study ego psychology, but I saw it. I was working with somebody who was in my training program in London, in England. I'm so glad I said that, like you know where England is. Sorry. Anyway, I started a program at Roehampton, and several of the people wanted to do some private work, which I did because I knew I was only there for short amounts of time, and if they could move on a little bit. It turned out she had been sexually abused from a very early age. And in our session, she was able to find her being before she'd been sexually abused. And it started when she was an infant. So she literally went back through her movement, through her imagery, through whatever, a lot of things that went on. She found the time when she was without that trauma that she had to deal with. And that allowed her to start moving forward. And it was extraordinary. And we talked about it. She wrote about it for a long time. She's very significant in the world today in terms of what she does with dance. And I've always remembered that. And when I was, at NYU, we used to get together, Iris Griffin-Gaynor and I, or Jane Cathcart. We would get together and we'd do peer supervision or peer moving together to discover things. And I remember this time with Iris, we were moving, and I discovered the time before I had fear and how my movement was so different. And I discovered the moment when the fear set in my body. So, I've always moved, and I walk my talk. So anyway, I learned from clients, I learned from my own experiences, peer supervision, and so forth. Yeah.
Mm. So thinking about all of this that you've shared with me and all of your historical knowledge and your current knowledge, what would you like to see carried on to the future of the next generation of dance movement therapists?
Well, I think there's one story I do want to share, and there's two actually, because they're very significant, and that answers the question slightly differently. I want to say this because recently somebody said something to me about not being involved in social change or something, and I thought, do they know who they're talking to? I created the first European programs. I worked on every continent, like 5 continents, not 7, but 5, starting programs with every culture, every whatever. So now here's a summer in Greece. I'm working at Skiro Center. And in my group, it's about 8 or 10, but I just want to give you the highlights. There was the president of one of the major banks of England. There was the CEO of an international engineering company. There was a head social worker, somewhere way up in Scotland. There was the first gay woman to come out in Galway, in Ireland. There was a medical doctor from England who announced to the group that he was a male chauvinistic pig as he was smoking his cigarette and drinking his beer. There was somebody from Esalen, one of the directors of Esalen. So that gives you a kind of idea of the variation of this group. So there were different sexes, there was different races, there was different sexual persuasion. And I thought they were going to kill each other. And I swear I can't remember if they were there for 1 week or 2 weeks, but I used to do kinds of happening theater dance pieces that they would create based on something that came up for them as we moved through different issues and themes. So that meant everyone participated in everybody's dance drama, so to speak. I think it was 2 weeks, something for them. At the end of the 2 weeks, the head of the Bank of England, one of the banks of England, said, I don't know why somebody doesn't take this to the United Nations. We have created peace here in 2 weeks. Why do we have wars all over the world when they can be doing this and creating peace in 2 weeks? And everybody agreed. And by the way, everybody was sitting with their arms around each other and rocking and holding and loving each other. And at the beginning, I can tell you right now, the gay woman from Ireland and the male chauvinistic pig were going to kill each other. They ended up being in love. I don't mean, but you know what I mean? Everybody loved each other. That to me was a main lesson, a main lesson. And 2 weeks, are you kidding me? So when someone says to me personally, you know, that maybe I don't understand what's going on in the world, oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. When I've worked with anybody you can mention and every kind of population from everywhere in the world, yes, I do. Anyway, that was very powerful. And I still think about it. I still think about it. The other one was I'd been invited to Prince Charles's mentor, Mountbatten's, used to do a huge conference in London, a body, mind, spirit conference. And I was an invited guest one year. And the invited guests would give a speech one day, and then they would do a workshop the next day. And I always come up with these fancy titles, and I mean, that's my creative process works. So in my title, which I don't remember what it was, it didn't say it was dance therapy, but I give my speech and I talk about it and on and on. And the next day, people come to the workshop, which in the title was not dance therapy, but if they come to my lecture, they would have known they were going to be moving. And I show up in this room with crowded 60, 70 people, all in, the men all had three-piece suits on and big heavy shoes and ties, and the women in their pantsuits. And it was a pretty elderly looking crowd. And my colleague that was working with me at Roehampton at the time came with me, and she looked at me, she said, "Oh, I'm so glad that you and not me." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't have a clue." So the first thing I did was say, "I'm so sorry, they did not announce in the program that this would be a movement workshop, dance movement. It's dance therapy. And this is dance for personal growth and insight. And it's going to be very, energetic probably. So you will not hurt my feelings if you leave. I really understand there might be something you want to go to, that suits you better." There's this blank stare on everybody. And I give them a minute or two and I say, "Really, you're not going to hurt my feelings. Feel free." Nobody goes, nobody leaves. Okay. So I thought, okay, this is what the universe has given me. This is what I'm going to work with. So then I say, "Now you might be a bit more comfortable if you take your shoes off. And I understand, you might be a little bit nervous, but it's going to be hard to move, and the floor's okay. It's clean. I made sure it's clean and it's not slippery." Nobody moves. Okay. So my friend again looks at me, gives me the look, and we get up. And I say, "Okay, well, we're going to be moving." And and by the way, there was a very, very old lady there, elderly. She was white haired and she was shaking. She had palsy. And I thought, she's probably going to die in my workshop. This is the end of my life, my career. But I did everything I could do. Okay, I can't control the world. So we get up, and whatever I did, I started very slowly and gently, and I tried to pick up some cues and just get a little bit warmed up and whatever we were doing. And probably within 4 minutes, there was screaming and yelling and jumping and throwing themselves, and ties coming off and shoes coming off and sweat coming down. Sorry. And it's like, I was like, whoa. I mean, trying to hold this group and try and give directions and try and keep people from dying and killing themselves. And finally, able to end it. And I take a deep breath. And I say, "Well, you guys sure surprised the hell out of me." I said, "But why am I surprised? This is the country that has Stonehenge. This is the country where Jesus was supposed to have spent his lost years." I go on and on about all the places, all the holy places. And I said, "You were just hiding, weren't you?" And they started to laugh. And then the elderly, very elderly woman, she had to be well into her 80s or 90s, raised her hand. She said, "Can I say something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "I was prima ballerina with," she names famous ballet company. She said, "And when they forced me to retire 40 years ago," she said, "I didn't know what to do because all I knew was dance. So I went and I've been volunteering with special children. They're called autistic children. And I love it. And they love me. Is there anywhere I could study this?" So that, again, that was another, for me, what I call the Alma moment, when Alma said she never doubted dance. Mm-hmm. It was me knowing, what I got from that is we are genetically programmed to dance and to move. We have to make things happen and understand it. and where we go in that imaginative place, and where we discover things and where healing happens, and bringing them together. And this is what a lot of the students today are missing, and that's what is sad for me. And I hope that students will come back to that, because we're not a social work degree, we're not a counseling degree. We have our own essence, our own ethos, our own beingness, and please don't forget it. And I understand getting all these, different degrees and letters behind your name to get a job. I understand that, but don't forget the magic that we can make happen. And our universe needs it now more than ever.
So this ties perfectly, into my last request. And I heard you talking earlier about the embodiment and how you had folks move together at the panel. And I would like to extend an invitation, if you would like, no pressure, to just seated here together, just sharing a little dance with me.
One of the things I learned from Kessenberg is that the hands do everything that the whole body does. So if you can allow your hands to begin their dance, even though we're seated, and begin to express your soul's message today through the hands, you, me, we will learn what our next step is today. That will take us to the place we need to be for our own personal healing, change, comfort, knowledge. And if for some, you're starting to feel that urge anywhere else in your torso, like I immediately felt it in my shoulders, they wanted somehow to become part of that. And there's no need to even think about what it is, because we're getting the message from our soul self, our essence. And as I said at the end of my acceptance speech when I got my honor 2 years ago, the dance therapist in me bows to the dance therapist in you. Namaste.
Namaste. Oh, it has been delightful for me to get this opportunity to talk with you. I'm really thankful for all of the wisdom and knowledge and stories that you've shared today, and movement. I've been wanting to move with you this whole time because your gestures that accompany your speech are so rich. And so you've been drawing me in with that the entire time. So thank you so much, Dr. Leventhal. It's been delightful.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So maybe we've taken a little bit of each other and have something there, and we'll move forward with that.
I hope so. Definitely.
Great. Thank you.